Okay, can we start, please? Today we have Monika Sosnowska to speak. Let me just remind you that it's in a month's time that we will have Henri Sala on the 2nd of March and Mary Kelly on the 9th of March, and nothing in between in this series. I first saw a work by Monika in the Serpentine Gallery in 2004. I don't know how many of you saw that. I was completely nonplussed. I walked through these very drab, colored wooden corridors. They weren't really corridors, they kind of amounted to a strange kind of labyrinth. And you walked along and you met people in both directions, coming and going, looking terribly perplexed. And then you ended up in a corner and there was a gallery attendant sitting on a stool. And I don't know why, but that was the most shocking moment of my life, I think. It was very strange, indeed. What you could also see was bits of the ceiling of the Serpentine. And I think that encapsulates a lot of Monika's work. There's a space within a space. And the effect of that space within a space is to alter the viewer's response to the space. And in this case, one of the spaces is the gallery space. You don't know what to do in this gallery. You're not looking at an object, you're not looking admiringly at a painting. You're absolutely trapped in this damn thing, which is inside, like you can see the escape bits up above. So I think that what one can say about the space, perhaps in relation to architecture, is that you have a viewer, that the potential space of art, her space, forces an opening in the actualized space of architecture. And it's in that relation that is the exciting one, as far as I can see. My next intimate meeting with your work was through the work of a dissertation student at the London Consortium who just wrote about one-to-one. I won't say anything more about it because she's going to speak about one-to-one today, but it more than exemplifies the point I've tried to make. So please welcome Monika Sosnowska.
Hello. I will show today not only my works, but also some images, some photos which I took in Warsaw, just to add a little bit more information to add the context to my works and to show how I work and where my works come from. I moved to Warsaw in 2000 after my study in Rijksacademie in Amsterdam, and I had at least two reasons to go there and to stay. One was that the city seemed very interesting for me in this moment because since '89 it has been in a big transformation from one system to another, and it was very visible in the city. And the other reason was that after being abroad for 2 years, I had a feeling that I have a distance to my own country and I can look at it again from another perspective. So 2000, this image probably is not from that time, it's a bit from another moment. But talking about changes, the most visible changes were of course in architecture, in Warsaw. Not everything changed for better. There were some damages as well, and some new buildings appeared which replaced sometimes the better ones. But my activity was not to criticize it, but rather to observe this. The biggest problem in the city after '89 seemed this building, Palace of Culture and Science. built in '55 as a gift from Józef Stalin to the Polish nation. And of course, the first intuition, the first feeling which people had after '89 was to destroy the building, this unwanted gift. But apparently it was too costly to knock it down, and we still have it, and even now the building is on the list of the national heritage, so we will have it for much longer. But our city authorities, decided instead of destroying, they thought that maybe it's possible to hide it. And there were a lot of architectural competitions for what to do with this area, which is around this giant, the tallest building in Warsaw. And there were some projects, but so far none of them was successful because it seems kind of impossible to hide it, because the base of the building is large and it always somehow stick out. It's always central. It always seems the most important building in the city. So it was not possible to do that, but it was possible to take a revenge on the past epoch on many other buildings. And I document some of this acts of aggression against communism. They were buildings which were not very significant, but some of them, they were beautiful, and in my opinion, it wasn't worth really destroying them. But in an early capitalism state, as we are at the moment, the money rules, and in most cases, even if there is a lot of friends and admirers of such architecture, we don't manage to support, and these buildings are, even if they are great examples of architecture, they are knocked down. For example, this one, the building which was built in '63, the first self-service market, a shop in Warsaw, a fantastic, very innovative roof construction. It was awarded in Sao Paulo for the most innovative construction of the roof. The engineers used the same method like for building bridges. So actually the roof was hanging it was hanging on the wires and standing on two pillars and front and back wall. The shop was decorated by a great artist like Edward Krasiński, for example, and many others. They were fantastic wall paintings, reliefs, but also just the functional design was extraordinary. But as you see, the photos from the '60s, there were not really many options of goods. Everything looks the same. On the first shelf, I think there are bottles of vodka or I don't know what, something in the bottles and cans. So here is a view on this beautiful structure and the queue I think for the opening of the building. And then was finished with the wood inside. Very light, very beautiful construction. Of course, it was not renovated for years, and the building was in a horrible condition in a moment when the city authorities decided to destroy it. So it was kind of easy to do that, to knock it down. During this 10, 11 years, I have not been looking for just the significant changes, but rather look at Warsaw from my own personal perspective. And I took a lot of photos of the places which were just near my house. Like, for example, I found this abandoned shop there was a broken window, so I could go inside and take this photo. So it looks like if someone was really aggressive towards the space, and it took my attention because a year before I found this shop, I realized this project, which is very similar to this, but for my ceiling, substandard ceiling, I was inspired by a central station in Warsaw, which also was not renovated since it was built in '72, and it was in a horrible state. This piece is now a permanent decoration of the bar in Basel, a Kunsthalle bar, and the manager of the bar hated it, as he believed that the bars are really, the pieces are really falling apart and may kill someone. So there were a lot of places which really drove my attention, like this stadium. Also, prestige building from '55, the same year as Palace of Culture and Science. It was built for the 10th anniversary of communistic Poland, and the architects designed actually a beautiful complex, but builders were really in a hurry for a special event, and they did not do it well. The hills, this is what is here, were actually built from rubble from ruins of Warsaw, from houses, from destroyed houses from a war time. And actually, there were gossips that maybe there are even some bombs and weapons in this hill, because nobody checked this properly. And as they were so much in hurry, then that this could be really true. So the stadium functioned maybe for 10 or 15 years, then it started falling apart. And after '89, somehow organically, it transformed into the biggest bazaar in this part of Europe, where mostly refugees and people coming from the Far East, from Ukraine, from Russia, from Korea, and other places, Vietnam, were coming and selling mostly pirate goods. And the whole stadium, this is a train station on the stadium. So people were coming, they were not even coming to the city, they were coming directly to the stadium and storing and selling or storing their product, their goods. The architecture of the bazaar grew, as I said, organically around the stadium, not only on the stadium, but around it, composing this kind of city. And the vendors, they were designing on, the sellers, they were designing own stands. There were, as you see, there were endless rows of little stands and storages. Around the stadium also grew small Vietnamese community, which created like a small city with own cuisine, and actually they were only the ones who used the stadium. Still, they used the stadium as a stadium, so they were playing football there. I was there many times, and I also I got inspired by this self-made constructions, the constructions for exhibiting this whatever they were selling. And I realized a sculpture which in the end looked pretty abstract, maybe like Solowit construction, but indeed it was a copy of the this brown thing on the right side, it was a copy of the shelves, but put together, if it looked like after hours, like the stools were standing straight, not horizontal but vertical. So if someone really finished selling and compose something else. Or I copied this trash bag holders, almost exact copy of the found object from the bazaar. And again, my observation from my neighborhood, a blockhouse, another symbol of the past epoch, but with a demonstration of individuality. People hated actually living in such a gray identical units, and they started inventing more individual spaces, even by painting, just by painting balconies with another colors or building on small architecture. So this was done earlier, like before 2000 or just after 2000. Now the blockhouses look totally different. They are all covered with styrofoam and painted with bright colors, but already designed by developers or by the companies which are isolating the buildings. So from gray communism, now we ended up in a really colorful capitalism, and all these houses are really demonstrating us that we are in a completely new epoch. This is a view from my window from the first apartment where I lived in when I moved to Warsaw. I lived in one of this kind of housing estates called Brudno, and this is a view from my window on the beautiful romantic sunset above the buildings. So as I said, I was not only observing the moment, the changes which were happening, but also I was looking at my memory, remembering certain things and trying to understand how certain aesthetics work on my emotions. And I built some corridors, for example, some spaces using or copying the aesthetic which I remember from schools, from block houses, a typical oil-based paint, like a green oil-based paint paneling. It was actually everywhere. Here I built a corridor which was not accessible because it was just 10 centimeters wide, but there were doors there, and I installed a light behind the door, so it suggested that there is life behind it, but behind the doors, but of course nobody could see what exactly is there. Or this corridor, which I built for Venice Biennale in 2003, I built it in perspective. Here is a model. So the first wall was a real size. The door about 2 meters high, but the back wall was just 20 centimeters high. So the illusion was that the corridor is very long, but then entering it, people figured out that this is actually just a few meters long space. Or this smaller piece, I bought a handle, probably one of the last ones from the mass production, an aluminum handle which I remember from my childhood. It was everywhere because it was the only accessible, but I transformed this also into something more individual, so I left my fingerprints on it. Not only fingerprints, but I squeeze it as well. And then further inspirations like the balustrade, which is cut out the balustrade, also like a typical from the block houses, from the staircases, metal bars with the PVC on top. So here it looks more like escaping, like an animal. Or later I built this staircase, the whole staircase, which is now still in the exhibition in K21 in Düsseldorf. It is also a copy of a kind of modern structure which belonged to the concrete block house, but this time it is not functional. It is laying on top of the part of the building, if it was like just resting or if it was faded. And again, I use the same material, this PVC, so typical, but not used anymore. And the end of the staircase was like falling apart, or like the balustrade separated from the stairs, so it looked like endless or like more open construction, or more, I would say, optimistic version of this project that it already shows a kind of transformation, not only the death of an object of a certain style. It's a too long staircase for too short space. So I would say from modern shape it become more Baroque structure. Another view. And later, after a few years of living in this this housing estate called Brudno, I moved to the best part of Warsaw, which is called Żoliborz, but as the whole Warsaw was under construction at that time, I also had in front of my house a kind of transformation. There were some workshops, some shops pulled down, and to give the space to the new apartment block, more luxury, not a concrete one, but something what is very common now in Warsaw, kind of gated block. We have a lot of gated communities now in Warsaw. The blocks together with the fences, so they seem more secure, but indeed it's not truth. It's just I think an advertisement of the developers in order to sell more apartments. So anyway, this is the view which I had, but each day it looked differently because it diminished at the beginning, and then later it became something else. And this is a work of mine. It was not directly inspired by this, what I saw from my window, but I think this piece grew under the spirit of the changes in Warsaw, a modern ruin, so a fragment of the wall with the rubble. Or this piece, I also showed this one twice, once in MoMA in New York, and then for the second time in Schaulager. Here is, this is the more sculptural version. In MoMA it was just a space with a with the ceiling in the middle of the space with a hole. So it was a space with the sculpture laying on the floor. While here is the ceiling become also a sculpture, and from a distance it looked like a real damage and a real rubble. But coming closer, of course, it was clear that this is a design object, and the rubble is not a rubble, but they are geometrical figures. So looking for inspirations and also working at the same time, I found this place. The works which I am showing are not chronological. I am jumping from one subject to another, but I was looking for a metal workshop. I wasn't working with metal before, but I wanted to realize a first project. Someone recommended me a small workshop which was located in this place, and this is a former houses factory, the place where the apartment blocks were produced, or the prefabricates for building the apartment blocks were made. And the factory closed, of course, because nobody wants to live in such a houses anymore, but there are still some remains of the former production, like this, or just the west, this is what stayed after. And I asked, I met this fabricator for the first time. This man who is standing on the garage, a very talented engineer who used to work for prototypes for his whole life, but nothing. He had nothing to do with art. He was designing military planes for vertical starting, but during communism, actually, he never could realize his ideas under his name, because everything what was developed together with his team was then sent to Moscow and then was produced under somebody else's name. And then we met, and he was very enthusiastic. Like he really felt that maybe this is another chance for him to work on prototypes. But of course, those were totally not functional. And my first project was this paper model, which I brought with me, and I showed him I would like to do this, but in a bigger scale and in a different material. And it took me a few seconds to sculpture it, because I just squeeze it in my palms. But of course, realizing this in a bigger scale is much more complicated. But he was very open and brave, and he invented tools for sculpturing this piece. As his workshop is really very basic, it was located in one of those garages, and he employed just 2 or 3 persons, depending on the project. But we started, and the sculpturing was a kind of a group process. I was telling him what I would like to achieve, and he was translating it into a technical language to his workers, and then they were sculpturing. And then I was reacting, or accepting it or not, and the engineer even worked himself. And then I figured out that we could use the facilities. This is what the former houses factory offers us. We could use the bridges for my sculptures. We could lift them up and paint them. And so the first piece was finished, and it landed on the walls of the Sprengel Museum. It hung only on 2 corners on the outside walls. It looked like if someone just dropped on it. And we realized together many other projects, smaller and bigger, more difficult and less difficult. But then I got really inspired by this place, by the houses factory, and I decided to build a house. And I came to him with this project, and I showed him a model, and I told him that I would like to build a skeleton of the modern building, not a particular copy of a particular building, but rather a typical construction, which has been used for many, in many office buildings or apartment buildings. But my construction was supposed to be taller than an exhibition space. And it meant to go to the Polish pavilion in Venice Biennale in 2007. I was very, I really wanted to realize this project, but I was very skeptical at the beginning. I knew that it will be rather on the edge of possibilities. But I brought this to this engineer, and he said, "Let's do it." It's like he has just a garage, a few people, and some hammers and screwdrivers, but he was very brave, and we realized this together, again using the possibilities which the factory offered us. So we built a house, 9 meter big, and I don't remember, maybe 20 meters long and 7 deep. I asked him also to advise me on the materials, because I wanted to make it real, not just to pretend to be a skeleton, but rather to keep everything as a potential house, that we could build a house. So we look at many existing buildings, but also with his knowledge, he advised me a lot. We did some tests on the models. We built some smaller models, but then finally we built the structure. And then the day came when we had to bend it, and this was pretty complicated, as one element was holding the other, and we had to work on the whole structure at the same time with a lot of people. We had to employ more person for this project. And when the friends of my engineer saw us sculpturing, they thought that we quarreled, that we meant to build a house, and now he's destroying it because we probably had a fight. But this is what we could do in Warsaw. We could only pre-sculpture, and the final shape this piece took in the pavilion, as it was really supposed to be under the ceiling of the pavilion, and it wasn't a flat ceiling, but there were some beams and some parts were higher. So we wanted to use the tools that what the Houses Factory offers us, so we could attach the work to the breeches, what was important for bending, but then the rest had to be done in Venice. So we transported it in pieces. It was logistically pretty complicated because, first of all, the bended elements took a lot of place in the cars, so we had a lot of trucks. But then we had to also check the level of the water in Venice, because the way to the Polish pavilion is under a small bridge. So depending on the water level, we could bring the elements or not, because the space becomes smaller. Here where it is supposed to be, and then we finally started the last stage of sculpturing. And the title of this piece is 1:1, and for me it has a few meanings. First, maybe it's a scale, because it's a real scale of the building, or it's like a skeleton of the building. The second is that there are two buildings, actually. It's difficult to say what belongs to the exhibition and what not, because this is not only the sculpture which I am exhibiting, but I am exhibiting it together with the building. Without the building, this construction wouldn't have sense. So there are two. It had a partner. Together with the pavilion was composed work. it looked like if two buildings were taking the same place at the same time. And the third meaning maybe is the result of the fight which these two buildings had. The result is one-to-one. As I said, is like one kind of this construction parasite, the building. It almost destroyed the space because it couldn't be functional anymore as an exhibition space. But on the other hand, the building, it parasited, but on the other hand, it also used this as a quality for for its existence. So that's it. And then, of course, after the exhibition, we had to put this, not destroyed, but again deconstruct the piece and transport it back to Poland. And this happens in most of my projects, that they are very physical, they seem very solid, but in the end they exist only for a certain moment, for particular places. Like the same in Serpentine, the exhibition could only exist there in this building, and the same here, at least in this shape, it only existed here for this exhibition in this building. And there are some fragments. And I think that's it. Thank you very much. Not with me.
No. Okay. Do you want to say anything about that and its difference?
About the Schaulager,
Yes.
this one-to-one piece was taken later, exhibited for the second time in Schaulager in Basel. It got a new partner. It became totally different piece. It was. I think, in my opinion, it became more sculptural than the piece in Venice. Unfortunately, I did not take any photos because I thought that maybe for this presentation I will show just a few examples of my works, but together with the context. But this was the second time, and now the piece is in a storage, and I think if I ever decided to show it again, it will be again a new piece. So with the site-specific projects, they always become new when they get a new site. They become totally new projects.
Okay, do we have comments, questions?
Your work received in Poland, obviously very international, and you've worked so much abroad and you've exhibited in amazing spaces, but how is it received in Poland, or what reactions?
Actually, there is a weird thing. I do not exhibit much in Poland. I don't know why, maybe because the projects are very complicated and sometimes expensive. So the bigger ones I could only make for special occasions, like the one-to-one piece actually was commissioned by a national gallery from Warsaw for a Polish pavilion. But another presentation, I don't remember. My first exhibition was in Poland in a gallery called Laboratorium, and it was, I think, well perceived. People were interested, but since then I really did not have a bigger presentation. I participated in some group shows with smaller pieces, but not really with something serious. And it's always difficult to talk about how my works are perceived, it's maybe better to ask this question the public than the author.
Thank you. I've got a question in relation to how you exhibit or display your work. Is it was really interesting to see how much the work is actually embedded in a context, yet when it is being exhibited, it is kind of taken away from that context. And I wonder in how far it's important for you that is then being separated and is being viewed in a sort of wide cube context, or in how far you also consider displaying your pieces on site or in a location, or how you see that relationship between where the piece comes from and where it goes and how you display it.
That's a pity that I really don't have these photos from Schaulager, because it was my first exhibition where I presented a group of works, and before I rather realized a single project, like a project for a particular place. So the place, the exhibition place was really important. This was the context for the piece, but of course it wasn't that clear. I wasn't just inspired by the place, by the exhibition place. It was rather a medium for expression, but of course the inspirations are very complex. They don't only come from Warsaw and from this what I see, but this is just to give a bit of a background, possible inspirations. But Schaulager was the first exhibition where I decided to show I don't know, 7 or 8 pieces, and some of them were older, and I did it for the first time, that I presented some pieces for the second time. And they were, I did it on purpose. I wanted to do something in spite of me, because up to that moment I was saying, like, I am just doing site-specific, they are here and never again. But there I thought, what will happen if I show them without the site and make them, like, give them something, a totally new exhibition space. And what I figured out, that they become more sculptural. Like, even if I presented the spaces, I showed the corridor, which later was here in London, the Hayward Museum, the corridor which was horizontal and then become vertical and horizontal again. For the first time I showed this in the Muzak Museum in Spain, and in Schaulager it became also an object, because you've got outside walls. I painted it gray, so it looked more like an abstract form or an element of architecture. And then I presented also one-to-one piece, which became again totally different to the Venice presentation, and the hall with the rubble, again something else. So I figured out that the pieces are changing indeed when they are in a different places, when they are not site-specific. And not only that they become sculptures, but they also mean something else. In Polish Pavilion, the construction, the skeleton of the building was, it got also another context, because Polish Pavilion was built in 1920s, I think, and so it was also a fight between two modernisms, and the one which is very well perceived in Poland now, this one from before the war, and with the other one which is more related to communism. So this was this extra meaning to the piece. While in Schaulager, it was a fight with totally different styles. It was a modern construction with a contemporary building. So it got a new life. And what else? Like the context of the aesthetics which I use is, of course, it's someone who knows where they come from. It gives something else to the pieces, but I think they can also be perceived without knowing this. As certain things are also international. I think the painting of the walls with the oil-based paint, I think in Great Britain also existed in the public buildings, in schools or somewhere else, and probably the same color, and other elements like PVC as well. That it was popular in the kind of international modern style in many buildings.
Okay, I think I've got it. Thank you. Yeah, I guess I would be interested in just hearing your thoughts in relationship to how central the concept of the ruin is, and I suppose not simply, like some of the comments you were just making now. Initially, I was thinking about this, how important the transition from socialism to capitalism was for your work, and what happens when the kind of turbo-capitalism is sort of perhaps complete as a project, how that might shape the kinds of projects you take on. But I guess I was also interested in the ruin as not as a kind of, always a kind of retrospective gesture, but also as a kind of perspective gesture into the kind of future. So it's just a couple of comments, and I'd like to hear some of your thoughts perhaps around that.
So as I said at the beginning, I am not trying to judge anything like what is better, what is worse. I think through my works I am rather trying to turn an attention on the process, that things like this are happening in the city, that certain things are changing. And for example, the ruin, the screen, the wall with the rubble, the sculpture which I made was presented in Italy, in a park full of real ruins, Baroque ruins, ruins of sculptures and ruins of real old buildings, ruins which most of people perceive as something beautiful, something what is a sign of a history. But the modern ruins, the ruin which I created, is in a general perception, it is nothing to be admired. It's something what is really a waste rather than a beautiful sign of the passing time. And I think it is also clear in some of my projects that I am not only showing this depression after destroying, but rather there is always a kind of change. I am trying to change the fortune of certain objects. So the rubble is not a real rubble, but it becomes geometrical figures. It gets a new life. Or the staircase, which is kind of squeezed, it's not only an act of aggression, but rather it becomes something else. I cannot say what it is, but it gets a new life. So this is, I think, my approach to the ruins and to the changes which are in the city.
Could I ask you to talk about the design of the exhibition? I think it was in the Pompidou Center in Paris, where you actually, as it were, well, in a sense you could call it a sculpture in itself, but actually you constructed the space, again, inside the space of the Pompidou, in order to show a very large number of works. And I think you had very particular aims in the construction of those corridors.
Yeah, so this was an unusual project because I was commissioned to do a kind of display of the exhibition, which was not just my independent work structure, but it was also supposed to be a functional object, functional in a sense that it had to hold the history and exhibit the other artists. And I've got a list of works, and it was I think almost a mathematical case creating this exhibition, because I started, first of all, I had an idea that I would like to design a freestanding exhibition. I thought that I'll not use the walls of Pompidou for hanging the works. But as we are guests, because this exhibition was about Eastern European kind of missed part of the history in the international art history, as we are like landing there, we could be like an island, or we could be a separate, almost a spaceship or a separate object. So that's why I thought about this, creating a freestanding construction, and then I started designing from a single wall. So each piece, which was on my list, and the list was constantly changing, got an adequate space or a piece of wall for display. And then I worked together with the curators to create narration, because the whole concept was to create a kind of linear exhibition where someone comes to the space and is not free to go and see one room and another room, but rather comes and look at it like at the book. So there is a first page and next and next. And knowing this, the curators could create a narration. So they could create a meeting points that some artists could meet. And it was also not chronological, but rather like artists which maybe some never had anything, and never had chance to meet, they could meet in this exhibition, and their works could meet in the exhibition. So it was pretty complicated. The first of all, because of amount of works and because of this narration which was supposed to be created, and also because all the works were connected, all the walls were connected. They were, one was ending, the other one was starting, and if one becomes shorter, then it pulled the other one, or if one wall became longer, it took up space for another artist. And then I also had to include all the regulations, safe and healthy regulations, and distances in between walls, and entrances, distances to the Pompidou walls. So actually the final effect, as I said, is almost like a mathematical case, that it was a result of all these things which I had to consider.
I'm not sure what I want to ask you about that, but did it feel very different from making a building and squashing it into another one? Because as you say, it was functional.
Yeah, it was functional. It was actually very stressful, because it was a responsibility for the other artists, and of course every artist has own idea for exhibition, but in this case it was it wasn't, in the end, it wasn't too bad. As I think most of the artists understood that we have a strength by being together in this one big structure, that not only the single works are speaking for themselves, but rather that this is the whole structure, the whole exhibition now presenting. So in this sense, it was much bigger strength than building one-to-one, for example.
No, I'm just wondering about the viewer walking through that. If I remember my experience at the Serpentine, or the Schaulager description, I mean, that strange dislocation that the viewer has, presumably the viewer didn't have it in this particular setup, although it was a very definitely separate structure within the Pompidou building. But in a sense, that aspect of it, is it lost? The fact that you did your space within a space, but precisely because it was functional, some aspect of the weirdness and the effect of that is actually lost. Because in a sense, when I spoke about the architecture, the potential of the art and the actualization of the architecture's functional.
Yeah.
And the minute you move into the functional,
exactly.
you detract it slightly.
Yeah, because it's totally different, of course, because like most of my works, the strength of them is like the space works, where I build spaces, the strength of them is because they are empty. There is nothing. There is a pure perception of the space, of emptiness, or of a certain aesthetics. And in this case, of course, it did not exist. It was a totally different case.
You showed the you showed one-to-one in Venice without any. I thought people could walk around.
They could.
Yes, but you chose to show it absolutely empty. I think that was quite striking.
I showed this what was necessary. It's like I didn't.
The people weren't necessary.
No, but actually no. It's like people were totally important, and actually they are always important to activate my works. Only when they are
Yes,
inside,
absolutely,
the
yes.
work
Yes.
starts. And also this was the difference between one-to-one in Venice and one-to-one in Schaulager, because in Schaulager it became a sculpture. People were afraid of it. They were not entering. And in Venice, people even climbed. So it become the same materials, the same structure. We only changed this slightly, but it became totally different work.
Can I ask you to talk about another work? It's Loop, which you did in the Modernist Gallery, which is 4 cubes, because I think that was quite interesting, the contrast you produced.
The Loop from
there.
Liechtenstein.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
So
I don't know what date that was. What date was that?
this was 2007 as well. It's again difficult to talk about this piece without showing images.
That's your fault.
I'm sorry. I thought that this lecture was supposed to be shorter. I was asked to do a kind of retrospective exhibition, and at the time I wasn't really presenting a group of works. I was only making site-specific. So I told to the director of the museum that instead of making a retrospective, which seemed impossible for me at that moment, I'll do even more site-specific work, and I will work with the architect who designed the museum. And we started working together, but immediately we figured out that it is impossible to create a common work. Like, we cannot design anything together. We start from totally different perspectives. It's like he has, I really admire his, Christian Keres, I really admire his works, his thinking, but we do not come across with, it's just impossible. But it was an interesting process, and finally I came with this proposal to actually limit again the exhibition space to a kind of corridor, to the path, which people usually do when they go through the four rooms of the museum. Here it was a very extreme situation because the corridors were totally wide, so they looked like if I totally erased everything. The museum and also the orientation points, I created a path, but actually there were two rings. They overlap each other, and people entering the space, when they walked only one direction, they never find a way out. They had to go to the other direction, and then they could exit from this trap. And being inside, the fragments of the corridor were slightly different, but slightly different. The angles were a bit different from each other, but it was difficult to notice. And so the whole experience was experienced with own memory, with being in a totally wide space, with experiencing time and remembering how many loops they did, and et cetera, et cetera. But apart from this, I was also asked to work with the collection of the museum. And of course, it was not possible to present any of the works inside of the wide corridors because it would be against the concept. But I presented them outside. It's again so difficult to explain this without drawing. It's like at the two exits of from this let's say labyrinth. I allow people to go on the other side, but they could not walk in the whole museum, but only in a fragment of this, because the rest was taken by the corridors. So they could see the structure, how it was built. So I actually did something against myself. because first I created the illusion, and then I let people to see how it was built. But then on the walls, I choose from the collection paintings and drawings which were mostly figurative, and they of course function as another kind of illusion. Like I wanted to choose very intense works which function like windows. So coming out from a kind of real illusion that people could touch, and being inside, they could go outside and see it and have a distance to of course, the borderline between the painting and the viewer is clear, but in the end, I think it works in the same way. Everything happens in imagination, because it's not true that this what we perceive in being in my works is physical, because again it happens in the head.
Once they'd seen the structure from the outside, could they deal with it any better when they went in again?
I don't know. We would have to ask them. But the illusion inside, it was pretty strong. And I remember myself, I sent my team to build the corridor, and I knew the project very well. I knew exactly how it looks like and what it is built from. But I think I got really trapped by myself. So I think it was pretty strong.
Hi, hopefully this isn't too long, this question. Your installations and your works tend to really test the spaces that they're shown in. And I was wondering about your relationship with curators or gallery directors. Oscar Tuazon, who also builds quite large scale works within these different white cube spaces and other spaces, mentioned recently in an interview with Philippe Perrot that he kind of works with the gallery curator or director until they say no, and has this sort of relationship of resistance. And I was wondering if you're in the same position. Do you kind of push so far as to when somebody says no, this is not possible, or how is your relationship with the people who work in these spaces or control them or run them?
In most cases, they understand. They understand before they invite me, because this is the way I work. So they already know what they will deal with. But it happened, I think, once to me that it was a total misunderstanding. It's not worth talking about this, but it was. It was completely. I think the curator had a better idea on my works than myself, and it did not work out for us. But I remember also once I had a meeting with the students of curatorial course in Krakow in Poland, and they asked me someone asked me this kind of question, like what to do if the artists will not want to listen to me. And what can I say? It's just, you can hang yourself.
Okay. I really liked your work, and this is the first time I've seen it. And what really impressed me was that some of your work, like one-to-one, was really strong. It has an almost instinctive, humane strength to it, whereas some of your other work are almost like puzzles, like the one with the corridor, that sort of brings the audience, the viewers in, and lead them through experience and make them think about the space they're there in. I was wondering, when you work, how much do you do it just by instinct, or how much do you think intellectually about the story behind your artwork, or the setting is in, or what is influenced by what it's supposed to mean to the viewers?
Yes, it's mostly, I think, instinct. Of course, as I said, the inspiration is not really clear. I cannot say that for this particular piece I was inspired by this what I saw, or by a book which I read, or it's like, I think it's a very complex process doing things. But in most cases I know, like in a certain moment I know what I want, and I use a medium which is necessary for this. And I don't have inspirations to make just big works or something what is like strong. And sometimes my works are small. It really depends on the concept, and I don't think that they are weaker or whatever if they are in a smaller scale. It's just that's what it has to be, and I feel pretty free to use the medium which I need for a certain moment. I studied as a painter, but then I started building spaces. Now I rather make sculptures, but I also, in the meantime, I sometimes do spaces as well. Like for last Venice Biennale, I was again asked to do a kind of pavilion for exhibiting the other artists. So it depends. Like if there is such a commission, I don't do it often. It's actually I probably would not do it anymore. Like to create exhibition spaces or commissions, like for functional, let's say functional purposes. I did it last time because I thought for Pompidou it was important for us, for all of the artists from this part of Europe, and I wanted to work with the curator Joanna Metkowska. We are friends, and it was interesting for me. But I don't want to use it as like a general practice for myself. So I never know. I cannot say that I am doing just this kind of things, and I will not do anything else. And the same was with site-specific, and then now not site-specific.
I'd like to return to your photographs of Warsaw. I mean, I don't know how many you've been taking, or
a lot.
A lot, right? It's as if you've made yourself into the Bellotto of Soviet Warsaw or of communist Warsaw. You know about Bellotto's paintings of 18th century Warsaw that were used to reconstruct the center. I mean, they tried, as far as I can see, to make Warsaw after the war look like Bellotto's Warsaw. And I remember when I was there, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I had a very strange déjà vu. I was in a cafe. I'd been walking through the center, and I thought, I've seen this before. I don't know how, somewhere. And then I realized it was just that moment of the afternoon when the shadows are a bit long. It's like the end of the afternoon, not really the evening. It's like the moment when you usually encounter Bellotto in the museum, actually. It's towards the end of the collection. And I realized, actually, I had seen it before, in a sense, in looking at Bellotto. And it occurred to me that in some kind of way, one could reconstruct, as it were, communist Warsaw from your photographs, except that modern buildings don't lend themselves to ruin, as the Nazis lamented. They become shattered and fragmented, and so the only way you could reconstruct them is as abstraction. But then you're doing it in the gallery, not on site, and so there's something site-specific in the gallery, but not. It's like a reversal of Robert Smithson's practice in a way.
Yeah, that's interesting. For sure, rebuilding communism will not happen within next 100 years, as this experience was so strong that I think a few generations will not do that. And it's a pity, I would say, as for some buildings. I think that's a pity that we lost them, and I would say, like personally, not as an artist, that putting everything to one bag after a certain epoch is not the right direction, I think. There were really great architects, I think I would risk to say better than many of the contemporary architects, and the buildings should remain like not as a icons of communism, but as an icon of a great architecture. And indeed, I don't know, it's always museums and galleries give the safe, quiet place for exhibiting. I realized a few projects in a public space before, sculptures as well, like for example, this construction of the vendors from the stadium is a permanent sculpture now standing in Wrocław in front of the new shopping mall. So it's like also like comparing two ideas on market, on selling. And there is also a sculpture of mine standing in one of the worst districts in Warsaw, in a housing estate in a park, which also was inspired by the place. But indeed, most of the works were presented in the galleries. But I think it doesn't matter. It's just the thinking I am creating, not the. I am not really. I can talk about the city, but not only in the city context. I think I can also talk about the architecture in the art field or in another field. I'm working now on a bigger project for New York for Public Art Fund, a big sculpture which hopefully will be standing in front of the Central Park, and this is so far I think the biggest challenge for me to confront with such a city, which is sculpture itself. I think is very strong, it's very intense, and working in a public context is difficult in general, but in New York, I think in particular. So we will see how this will have this experiment will end.
Have you got a ceiling on how large it can be? Because if you think of that stretch on the south side of Central Park and all the horse-driven carriages for the tourists and so on, it's extremely busy and full of little things.
Yeah.
So your sculpture would have to be really dominating to be seen.
Yeah, I didn't want to make something what is dominating, because it's not like you cannot compete with New York. It's like with the Rockefeller Center with such a buildings, it's like impossible. But I will refer to Mies van der Rohe building, and I think this sculpture will take me to another level of thinking. But it's difficult to talk about it because it did not happen.
No.
And
can I
maybe
just ask, have they specified a site, or do you
yeah,
use
yes,
it
it's
you
like they have 3 sites which they usually use for. So it's in front of the Central Park, in front of the Rockefeller Center, and in front of the City Hall. So there are the 3 venues. So in a way, it exists already as a museum because the public got used to it, that the art goes to these places.
I wanted to ask not so much about the architectural kind of projects, the corridors and things, but particularly your relation, I mean, essentially to metal. It seems, I mean, if we start from Brian's point, that obviously modern buildings don't really have ruins, they have like debris, and it seemed that, you know, you were very taken with, in some sense, the destruction of the buildings to make way simply for new ones in Warsaw. It does seem to me that the kind of metal skeletons, at one level, I mean, they create a moment between, you know, what at one level appears to be part of a process of destruction, but which is actually an act of construction. I mean, in the sense of getting the engineer and the workers to bend the metal. I mean, you're constructing a shape, but knowing that it will be read in some sense as being kind of deformed, as with the cube. And in a way, it struck me that at a kind of sculptural level, you kind of invent a ruin, or rather a kind of form of agency which is resisting its destruction and conversion into debris, because it's almost that some of those, you know, bent structures and the kind of appearance of strain which you've managed to build in to the construction, you could sort of compare with something very classical like the Lao Kun. And I think that's kind of very powerful.
Yeah, certainly the destruction is designed, or I wouldn't say, I'm always a bit skeptical about the destruction. I'm thinking that I'm not creating destruction, that my works are, yes, it's construction, that this is a planned like a transformation, let's say. It's maybe about failure, but with a potential at the same time. But I think it also has other aspects, like especially with the metal pieces. I am trying to copy, because I don't use ready-mades. I don't find these objects. I don't cut out balustrades from buildings. I copy. I try to make an exact copy, and I even try to find the right builders, right fabricators to do that, who would weld, who would connect the pieces in a similar way as they were done at the time as the original were. So from the 70s, for example. And at that time, the metal workers were, I don't know, mostly drunk, and they were welding with a cigarette in their mouths, and that it was a certain roughness in this object. So I would say I'm trying. I make a kind of archaeology in the discovering of this process, of the style of a method of building these objects, but I do it now in this moment. And again, I could say they are like hyper-realistic, but on the other hand, even they are not hyper-realistic, because they are not pretending. They are, at the beginning, they have this potential of being a real objects, but I never give them a chance to be functional. I never give them a chance to be a real object. So it's, I think, very complex, I would say. And indeed, maybe in a certain moment, they even, I can say, they are like a classical sculptures when they are exhibited.
It is their strength, what you've just described, that they aren't functional. I think we have exhausted you. So you gave a short lecture, but we've kept you discussing for 50 minutes. It's very good for you.
Thank you very much.